Hey team, we are jumping off after spring break, diving back into Africa's governments. Before we got out for spring break, you guys were looking at some of our general terms that we've went over before, specifically types of governments and economic indicators, trade barriers. And this week we're going to start looking more closely at the specific countries that those things impact and how. Today, we're going to be looking at the governments of three different countries in Africa: Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. Let me see if I can get this off our screen. Hide. Okay. So, first, we know that Africa was partitioned by European powers. By the early 1900s, European nations had colonized nearly all of the continent of Africa, meaning that they had broken apart into separate territories belonging to different European nations. The African people had little say in the laws that were made under European rule, meaning that they essentially were considered the same as when we talked about Israel, and it used to be called the British Mandate System, called Palestine before it was divided up in 1948 between the Jewish people and the Palestinian Arabs that were there. They partitioned the land of Africa in the same way. Same concept, different continent that we're talking about now. Today, there are more than 50 independent African nations. If you click on the link right, I don't know if it'll bring it up. There it is. There's my mouse. How many nations are in Africa today? It will show you exactly how many nations are in Africa today. Some of these countries have established democracies, while others are suppressed by autocracies. Both of these terms you'll notice are blue and highlighted. If you click on them, it's going to take you in directly to the Webster definition of a democracy as well as an autocracy for you. So let's review before we dive in. Government types, how do citizens participate? Number one, again, you'll see that autocracy and democracy are hyperlinked. If you click on those, that's going to pull up the Webster Merriam definitions of those, but we also have the definitions listed here for you. Autocracy is when one person possesses unlimited power and citizens have limited role in the government, where democracy is very opposite, if you will. It's the antonym of this. It's supreme power is vested in the people and exercised by them directly or indirectly through a system of representation involving free elections. And we'll talk more about that in just a bit. So let's review two types of democratic governments. We've talked about this all year, that of course there's a lot of different types of democracies, but the main two that we talk about are parliamentary and presidential democracies. Parliamentary, of course, is where citizens are elected by members of their parliament, and then the members select the leader. The leader works with or through the legislature directly and not separate from. We saw the most probably recognizable for all students is going to be that of Great Britain. When we're talking about presidential system of government in which the leader is constitutionally independent of the legislature and citizens directly elect the leader, where the leader works separate from the legislature, the most easily identifiable for us is, of course, the United States, because our own government operates under this particular standard as a presidential democracy, and our president is elected separate from our legislature and works independently. I do have a video clip that if you click on this blue hyperlink down here, that goes into about 6 minutes of explaining the difference, and it does use the UK and the US as two kind of opposite examples of these two types of democracies. Republic of Kenya. It is a presidential, representative, democratic republic. That's a mouthful. Even for me when I look at it, guys, it's a mouthful. I want you to take time when you're looking at this just to break the words apart. Presidential, it means they have a president. Representative means that it's obviously going to be democratic because it's the people are representing this type of government by electing officials. And it's a republic, meaning that it's a democracy of elected officials. And if you click on the blue hyperlink, it will take you to the Merriam-Webster definition of a republic, because sometimes we don't take the time enough to talk about that word and define it. So I've hyperlinked it for you. Background when we're talking about the Republic of Kenya is that it became independent from Great Britain in December 12th, 1963. The president is often called the father of Kenya, is Jomo Kenyatta. Kenya has recently experienced many changes in its government. It got a new constitution in 2010. It had a lot of changes in it. Bicameral legislature, meaning two-pronged legislature. The abolishment of a prime minister. So there's a transition from parliamentary democracy to presidential. Having female representation from each of Kenya's 47 countries. So having a larger female presence as well. This is Jomo Kenyatta. He was the president from 1964 to 1978. This is just one image of him, but if you do a simple Google search, you'll find many on the internet. The 2010 Constitution also promises to reduce corruption in the government and to get better protections of citizens' rights going. It is currently a democratic republic with an elected president and a bicameral legislature due to this and due to the changes that happened. This is the Kenyatta International Conference Center in Nairobi. It is where Kenya's government is seated. Cool building. Nice geometry to the building. Leadership in Kenya. Kenya's president acts as both the chief executive and the head of state. As the chief executive, Kenya's president has a lot of power involved in day-to-day business of running the country. And because he is also the head of state, he has to go to all of Kenya's ceremonies and meet with other leaders around the world, which is a similar function to our chief of state. This was Kenya's fourth president and is currently the president in Kenya, Uhuru Kenyatta. Again, this is a picture that I pulled from the internet, but there's lots of them out there of him. How leaders are chosen. So the president is directly elected by a popular vote from the people. Again, we talked that it's a presidential democracy at this point. And the question I have down here, does this make the Kenyan government a presidential or a parliamentary democracy? We know the answer to this question is presidential, because to be a parliamentary democracy, he would not be able to be elected by a popular vote from the people, but would rather be chosen by the legislature. He or she, depending on who's elected, serves a 5-year term in Kenya and is eligible for a second term if elected. The legislature. So the Parliament of Kenya is the country's bicameral legislature. It has two houses, the Senate and the National Assembly, and citizens are responsible for electing members for both of these houses. This is a picture of inside Kenya's parliament. Again, I have said it's a presidential democracy many times, but it is a presidential democracy. Citizens directly elect the president for Kenya every 5 years, and the president does work completely separate from the parliament and is not elected by the parliament, making it a presidential democracy. What is the role of the citizen in Kenya? Well, you have to be 18 years old to vote, similar to us here, but voting is not required by law. It's not required here either, but you just have to be 18 to vote. As a democracy, its citizens can participate in voting and elections, and the citizens vote for the president as well as the members of parliament, those two houses we talked about. Here's a couple of pictures of voting that was going on in Kenya. August 2017 was the most recent presidential elections for Kenya, and that's where these pictures were pulled from. Flaws, there's always things anybody can do better. Even though Kenya is a democracy, the citizens do not have too much say in the government. Much of the decision-making process is made by the president and his party once they are elected. Freedoms are in the Constitution, but the government is dominated by the president and his office. Corruption has been a major problem, as many politicians have been evidenced to have taken bribes in the past. And also because many African cultures view politics as a male occupation, women are not equally represented in Kenya's government. There's improvements there we saw with the 2010 Constitution, and the representation of women from each of the districts inside of Kenya. But there's not complete equal representation inside of Kenya's government of females. Next, we're going to look, guys, at the Republic of Nigeria. It is, again, a presidential representative democratic republic. Those are the same 4 words that we saw in front of Kenya, and that is because it has a president that leads the country. It is a representative democracy, which is why we call it a representative democratic republic. The background when we are talking about Nigeria is that on October 1st, 1960, Great Britain granted Nigeria independence under the leadership of Abu Bakar Tafawa Balewa, the first Nigerian elected prime minister. At first, Nigeria was one of the more stable governments in Africa during decolonization. Nigeria did have a lot of violence and military rule from 1966 until 1999, and then a democratic government was finally established there in 1999. This was the Nigerian first elected prime minister. Guys, I mess up his name. You have to forgive me. I'm a Southern American, but I do try. Abu Bakar, and I keep wanting to say Abu Bakr, Tafawa Balewa. If you find a better pronunciation, I encourage you guys to record yourselves and send it to me, okay? The National Assembly building in Abuja is home to Nigeria's legislature. It's a pretty building. I like the turquoise top. Leadership. Nigeria's president acts as both chief executive and head of state as well. We saw that when we were looking at Kenya just a moment ago. As the chief executive, Nigeria's president holds a lot of power, day-to-day business running the country, and as head of state, attends Nigeria's ceremonies, meets with leaders around the world, just like we discussed when we were looking at Kenya. So the Nigerian president also serves both of these functions. This is Muhammadu Buhari. This is Nigeria's president currently, right now. Again, there's lots of pictures out there. I encourage you to take a look. How leaders are chosen. Nigeria's president is directly elected by a popular vote from the people, and he or she serves a 5-year term and is eligible for a second term if elected. The Nigerian National Assembly is the country's bicameral legislature. It does have 2 houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives, and members of both houses are elected by Nigeria's citizens. Very similar to Kenya when we were talking about Kenya. This is inside of Nigeria's parliament. It is a presidential democracy. The citizens directly elect the president every 5 years, and the president works separately from Nigeria's National Assembly, which is like their legislature. Because of this, and because Nigeria's president is elected by the people and works separately from the legislature, it is a presidential democracy. What's the role of the citizen? Again, Nigerian citizens must be 18 to vote, just like Kenya citizens, just like American citizens, and it is not required by law that you vote. Citizens can participate in voting and elections, and they vote for the president as well as members of the legislature. 2019 was the most recent vote in Nigeria. Again, we're going to look at just a couple of flaws. No one gets it exactly right all the time. Nigeria is a democratic country, but still has flaws. Corruption, again, has been a major issue that has been highlighted in Nigeria, as politicians have historically been proven to take bribes and abuse their power to gain personal wealth and money from their position. Elections have been afflicted with fraud and unequal voting rights. Citizens cannot always rely on the courts to protect their rights and their freedoms, and women are also not equally represented in the government in Nigeria, just like they are not equally represented in the government of Kenya. The 2019 presidential election was free, fair, and well conducted. Historically speaking, when looking back, that was not always the case. The most recent election, though there were some critiques of things, as there always is with any election, even our own, it was considerably and markedly better than historically how things had gone. This is a picture of people walking up to cast their ballot. The last country we're going to look at today, guys, is the Republic of South Africa. South Africa became independent from Great Britain in 1910. Until 1994, South Africa had an oligarchy, and you'll notice that I did hyperlink the Merriam-Webster definition of oligarchy. Please review it. That was controlled by white leaders of apartheid. I also hyperlinked apartheid, and if you click on it, it will take you to the Merriam-Webster definition of apartheid. Today, the racially segregated government has ended, and South Africa is a democracy. I did put a small video down here. It's a BBC video that basically discusses apartheid in 90 seconds. It's not all inclusive, guys. Nothing 90 seconds when you're talking about the history of a nation and its people is going to be all inclusive, but it's a very good 90-second wrap up to explain what apartheid was in South Africa. The Houses of Parliament in Cape Town is home to South Africa's government. Guys, remember Cape Town? We talked about the water crisis in Cape Town last year in 2019, where they were concerned about the taps drying up. We talked about some of the great white sharks disappearing off the coast of Cape Town last year, which is unusual because they traditionally migrate there. And so this is the same area that we're talking about when we're looking at the Houses of Parliament, okay? So when you see this building, think of that same city we discussed when we were talking about the water drying up due to the drought last year and the sharks disappearing off the coast last year. Leadership. The president is the chief executive who holds the most political power. He or she is the head of government and the head of state. And he or she is the leader of the party with the most seats in the National Assembly. Cyril Ramaphosa is South Africa's president. This is a picture of him. Again, I encourage you to look out and go Google up some other pictures. Check them out in different settings. How leaders are chosen. The parliament selects one of its members to be the president, and he or she serves a 5-year term, no more than 2 terms. Just from looking at this and looking at this slide, you should already know when you're thinking about presidential versus parliamentary democracies, which one South Africa is. The legislature, the Parliament of South Africa, is the country's bicameral legislature, has 2 houses, the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces. Citizens elect members to the National Assembly, while lower provincial governments appoint officials to the National Council of Provinces. This is a National Assembly chamber. And again, if you hadn't guessed it already, it is a parliamentary democracy. The political party with the most members in the National Assembly selects the president. This is what defines and makes it a parliamentary democracy, because the president is not directly elected by the people. And that's what it says, major difference between a presidential and a parliamentary democracy. In parliamentary, that leader, whether it be a prime minister or a president, selected by the parliament or the legislature, whereas in the presidential system of democracy, it's directly elected by the people. The role of the citizen. Citizens must be 18 to vote, but voting is not required by law. Same as the other 2 countries, Nigeria and Kenya, that we looked at. Same as the U.S. As a democracy, its citizens can participate in voting in elections, and citizens vote for members of the National Assembly Parliament, who then elects the president. So they indirectly elect the president because they select the National Assembly, and then the National Assembly is the one that elects the president, making it a parliamentary democracy. Compared to Nigeria and Kenya, South Africa's democracy is much stronger. Elections are fair and the Constitution protects citizens' rights and freedoms. People can participate in South Africa's government by voting for representatives, expressing their opinions on issues, and running for office as well. Flaws. What's going on that they could do better? Well, personal freedoms are more numerous in South Africa since apartheid. Since apartheid was ended, which was the legal separation of the races. But even though they're more numerous, much of South Africa's wealth does not reach the Black population, which is the majority. This has caused a very low standard of living among half of the country's population. Okay, guys, I'm going to stop there with you. I hope that you enjoyed it. Guys, take time to go back through it. Make sure that you click on the definitions, watch the videos that I've got embedded. Have a great Monday back. I'm so excited you're here, and I'll see you tomorrow morning. Let me figure out how to get us stopped. One of these stops us. Do, 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 do.